Okay. This is lecture 76 in the ABCs of Communism series on YouTube, which corresponds to the chapter on primitive communism in Namibia in volume 6 of the ABCs of Communism, Bolshevism 2018, volume 6. And the title is, that chapter is Primitive Communism in Namibia. Just for a moment, I'm going to point out, here we have Namibia's northern border and its eastern border, and in the west it borders on the sea. This is a big country. It was, for many years, the fascist regime in South Africa considered Namibia to be its fifth province. But by 1990, it had civil war, a war in South Africa, greatly assisted by Cuba, defeated the South African army, and the regime here gave up. So, now, let's start with the geology. The area that is now southern Africa consisted of two main islands. First, the Kalahari Craton in the southeast, and second, the Congo Craton in the north. Now, these were parts of the land that later formed the African continent. Over millions of years, this area grew through the creation of mountains, exposing a greater landmass above the ocean. The first mountains were created in Namibia between 2.1 and 1.6 billion years ago during the Valian Age. And then I give the names of the different geological formations. And the lower Macolian Age, Rehoboth and Sinclair geological sequences. Now, the upper Macolian Age saw the creation of the second wave of mountains between 1.6 and 1 billion years ago. Today, the ground we walk on in the south of Namibia was formed during the upper Macolian. It is called the Namakwa Metamorphic Complex. The third period of mountain creation occurred about 800 million years ago, when the Congo Craton collided with the Kalahari Craton. The area between the two cratons had formerly been a shallow ocean where thick carbonate deposits had solidified into limestone. After the collision, the limestone was transformed into marble by the high temperatures and pressures and became the Damara Mountains. So, that brings us to the physical geography. Today, the Namibian landscape has 6 geographical areas. Each area has its own distinctive physical conditions and vegetation. These are the Central Plateau, the Namib Desert, the Great Escarpment, the Bushveld, and the Kalahari Desert. Now, take the Central Plateau first. This is a wide and flat central plateau running from north and to south, bordered by the Skeleton Coast to the northwest, the Namib Desert and its coastal plains to the southwest, the Orange River to the south, and the Kalahari Desert to the east. And you can kind of see it as a distinct unit right there. Now, this central plateau has the highest point in Namibia at a point called Konigstein with an elevation of 8,550 feet. It has the majority of Namibia's population, which is roughly the height, by the way, of Mexico City, to give you an idea of what breathing would be like up there. It has the majority of Namibia's population and economic activity. Windhoek, the nation's capital, is located here. Now, Windhoek, although arable land accounts for only 1% of Namibia, nearly half of the population is employed in agriculture. Physiographic conditions here are similar to those found along the escarpment, although the topography is uniform. Summer temperatures in the area can reach 104 degrees Fahrenheit, and frosts are common in the winter. Now, that brings us to Namibia's coastal desert. And I think you can kind of get a picture of how extensive that is. Its sand dunes were created by the strong onshore winds, and those are the strongest onshore winds in the world. The Namib Desert and the Namib Nakluft National Park are located here. The Namibian coastal deserts are the richest source of diamonds on Earth, making Namibia the world's largest producer of diamonds. The coastal desert is divided into the northern Skeleton Coast and the southern Diamond Coast. Because of the location of the shoreline, that is, at the point where the Atlantic's cold water reaches Africa, an extremely dense fog commonly covers it, creating Peruvian coastal types of microenvironments. The sandy beach comprises 54%, and mixed sand and rock add another 28%. Only 16% of the total length of this country is rocky shoreline. Coastal plains are dune fields, gravel plains covered with lichen, and some scattered salt pans. Near the coast, there are areas where the dunes are vegetated with hammocks. Namibia has rich coastal and marine resources that remain largely unexplored. The large Namib Desert is 55 million years old, stretches for 1,200 miles along the entire Atlantic coast of Namibia. It borders South Africa and Angola as well. In other words, that same desert goes on up there and down here. At any rate, it is made of hyper-arid gravel with no moisture that comprises both the plains and its dunes, and comprise the entire coastline. Its width varies from 60 to many hundreds of miles, and I think you can see that right there. In many ways, this reminds me of the Peruvian coast. Well, without getting into that, areas within the Namib include the Skeleton Coast and the Kalkoveld in the north, and the extensive Namib Sand Sea along the central coast. The sands that make up the latter come from erosion within the Orange River Valley and areas further to the south. As sand-laden waters drop their suspended loads into the Atlantic, onshore currents deposit them along the shore. The prevailing southwest winds then pick up and redeposit the sand in the form of massive dunes in the widespread sand sea, which are the largest sand dunes in the world. In areas where the supply of sand is reduced because of the inability of the sand to cross riverbeds, the winds also scour the land to form large gravel plains. In many areas within the Namib Desert, there is little vegetation except the lichens found in the gravel plains, and in dry riverbeds where these plants can access subterranean water. The Great Escarpment rises sharply to over 6,550 feet. Average temperatures, as well as temperatures, increase as you move further inland from the cold Atlantic water, while the lingering coast fogs slowly diminish. Although the area is rocky with poorly developed soils, it is nonetheless significantly more productive than the Namib Desert. As summer winds are forced over the escarpment, moisture is extracted as precipitation. The water, along with the rapidly changing topography, is responsible for the creation of microhabitats, supporting a broad spectrum of organisms, many of them endemic. Eventually, these microenvironments were important in Homo's occupation. Vegetation along the escarpment varies in both form and density, with botanical community structures ranging from dense woodlands to more shrubby areas with scattered trees. A number of acacia species are found here, as well as grasses and other shrub vegetation. Bushveld, the fourth area. The Bushveld is found in northeast Namibia, along the Angolan border. And in the Caprivi Strip, that is a vestige of a narrow corridor demarcated for the German Empire to access the Zambezi River. The area receives a significantly greater amount of precipitation than the rest of the country, engaging, and that he's talking about that area right there, is the Caprivi Strip, source of a lot of political problems. At any rate, the area receives a significantly greater amount of precipitation than the rest of the country, averaging around 16 inches per year. Temperatures are also cooler and more moderate, with approximate seasonal variations of between 50 and 86 degrees Fahrenheit. The area is flat and the soil sandy and unable to retain water. Located adjacent to the Bushveld in north-central Namibia is the Etoshan hardpan. It's a hard, usually clay-rich layer of soil lying at or just below the ground surface. So in that respect, it's very similar to the U.S. Great Basin. The soil particles are cemented together by silica, iron oxide, calcium carbonate, and organic matter that is precipitated from water percolating through the soil. Most of the year, it is a dry, saline wasteland, but during the wet season, it forms a shallow lake, covering more than 2,317 square miles. And I think you can get kind of a picture of that on the map there. The area is ecologically important and vital to the huge numbers of birds and animals from the surrounding savanna that gather in the region as summer drought forces them to the scattered water holes that ring the hardpan. The Bushveld area is identified by the WWF as part of the Angolan-Bopane woodlands ecoregion extending north across the Cunene River into neighboring Angola. Now, we come to the Kalahari Desert, probably the most famous part that known to most of you, which is here. We saw part of it was in South Africa, and but the major part of it is in Namibia. The Kalahari Desert is probably Namibia's best known geographical feature, shared with South Africa and Botswana, which is this country over here now. So it has a variety of localized environments ranging from hyper-arid sandy desert with special and unique zones. One of these zones, known as the succulent Karoo, is home to over 5,000 species of plants, nearly half of them endemic. In fact, fully 1/3 of the world's succulents are found in the succulent Karoo. The reason is the relatively stable nature of precipitation. The succulent Karoo does not experience drought on a regular basis, so even though the area is technically desert, regular winter rains provide enough moisture to support the region's interesting plant community. Another feature of the Kalahari, indeed many parts of Namibia, are what are called Inselbergs. These are isolated mountains rising above the plain, created by ancient plate impact movements that forced up sections of the crust, blocks being pushed together. And for, if you want to see a North American equivalent, it would be the southern part of the Rocky Mountains in Arizona, where you have these uplifted blocks that have been eroded away and leave a kind of what appears to be a serrated horizon. These uplifted blocks, when eroded, leave cores behind that form microenvironments for organisms not found in the surrounding desert. And this brings us to a discussion of the prehistory. Now, situated on the southwestern seaboard of Africa, Namibia is one of the driest places on Earth. This is also the world's most thinly populated country after Mongolia, yet it has the longest archaeological record of all the southern hemisphere desert regions, with evidence of humans' occupation from 4 million years ago to the present. In other words, this part of Africa had intermittent occupation by all 3 grades of humans, the Australopithecines, then the Erectus, and then the Sapiens. Although there are few deep stratified deposits, exceptionally well-preserved surface accumulations exist, with abundant Pleistocene stone tool remains. Holocene occupation, that is, the last 10,500 years, is common throughout Namibia, including one of the largest and most complex bodies of rock art in the whole of Africa. From 10,500 BP to the present, Namibia, Angola, and West Africa in general witnessed the socio-cultural evolution of primitive communism of hunting and gathering and tribal agriculture into the chiefdom stages, and finally the area featured the autochthonous emergence of class-divided and state-organized kingdoms. Now, before the lower Paleolithic, the oldest ape paleontological find comes from the Combat mine, Kombat, in Otavi. It is a jawbone of the Otapithecus namibiensis, with an estimated age of 12 to 15 million years. This Namibian Miocene hominoid from Berghaus, Namibia, is the first known from the African continent south of equatorial East Africa. It represents a major range extension of Miocene man-like apes or hominoids in Africa to a latitude of 20 degrees south. The holotype is a right mandibular corpus, preserving the crowns of the P2 through M3, partial crown and root of the P2, partial root of the canine, alveoli for all four incisors, and partial alveolus for the left canine. As I say, it was found during paleontological explorations of karst-filled brushes in the Otavi region of northern Namibia. The mandible has unique characteristics differentiating it from the other middle Miocene hominoids of Africa and Eurasia. It is the only fossil evidence of a pre-Australopithecine stage of hominoid evolution in southern Africa. So when you want to get to that, this is the area that we'll be looking at. Faunal analysis indicate that the brush block containing the specimen came from the latter part of the middle Miocene, about 13 plus or minus 1 million years ago. The lower Paleolithic has a scarcity of recorded sites in Namibia, and this prompted a vehicle-driving reconnaissance expedition in 2002. And these investigators covered selected parts of central Namibia. Along at the Zebra River, the Namib Dunes, the Paresis Mountains, and the Omatako River Waterberg Escarpment. Surface finds of modes 1, 2, and 3 lower Paleolithic artifacts occurred with high concentrations at the Zebra River. A team from the Namibian Paleolithic Field Research Program was searching a site close to the main Zebra River. At the edge of the site is a steep rocky gully filled with dense thorn scrub, and when the team entered the gully, it found a Paleolithic mandolin. A mandolin is a unique Namibian Paleolithic artifact. It has a slender shape. This particular 344 millimeter long mandolin seems to have started its life as a cleaver, or a chisel-ended hand axe, that was then thinned along the sides to create a ficron. A ficron is a long, narrow, two-sided or bifacial hand axe with concave edges. The discoverers believe this is one of many Acheulean Age African finds. The Namibian Paleolithic Field Research Program, NAMPAL team, is a group of geologists and archaeologists from the UK, the Netherlands, Egypt, South Africa, and Namibia. They are based at Zebra River, astride the Great African Escarpment. There they found artifacts still lying in clusters where ancient people had dropped them. These can be dated relative to one another. So the superficial findings and its loss of context is made up for by the sheer size of the canvas. The Nampal study area measures 50 by 68 miles. In 8 seasons of field walking, they had covered just a fraction of it. Now, my immediate thoughts when I read about this desert phenomenon in Namibia were of the Great Basin of the USA, where lithic stage, New World stage terminology, of course, sites are full of crude stone tools throughout. These Nevada sites are often found around pluvial lakes corresponding in age to the glacial episodes in the north. For many years, these Nevada finds were the subject of debate between the proponents and opponents of early human occupation of the Americas. At any rate, I was pleasantly surprised to find that the Nampal team had learned from the geomorphologic studies conducted by Professor Nick Lancaster at the Desert Research Institute of Nevada. One of the positives of surface archaeology, compensating for the lack of stratigraphic context, is that it exposes both the artifact scatter patterns and the topographic environment on which they were laid. In the Namibian case, these landscapes are essentially unaltered for at least 2 million years. The geologic stability mentioned foregoing, combined with consistently dry conditions, is responsible. Furthermore, aeolian deflation, where the wind blows away small particles, leaves clear concentrations of larger stones and artifacts on the surface. Therefore, we can see how early humans chose their living spaces in relation to the topography, water resources, game migration routes, and stone raw material sources of their time. Indeed, what we see now is what people would have seen then, minus the microtools of stone and, of course, bone and wood. Proving that artifacts lie largely in situ was easy. Lumps of stone are quite difficult for nature to shift, especially on flat land away from stream beds, which is where most Paleolithic societies chose to live. Here, heavy rainfall can only move dust, sand, gravel, and the smallest artifacts. Mechanisms that might move the larger ones, such as animal kicking or burrowing, root growth, frost heave, human agency, all act randomly. Thus they are very slow actors. So once dropped by humans, artifacts tend to stay put. Two observations proved this. First, natural forces cannot accumulate dense clusters of artifacts containing specific archaeological signatures. And second, some of these clusters still lie on the top of isolated mesas. If dynamic processes had been at work over time, these tools would have dispersed from the hilltops. The problem of dating is more challenging, but investigators found a partial solution. Although loss of context robs surface material of its best means of dating, there is one superficial mechanism for the relative dating of artifacts, and that in Namibia, as it has always been in Nevada, that of weathering can be measured. In other words, we can measure the relative degree of patina formation on stone tools. Patination refers to the alteration of the skin of the rock in a physically detectable, visible, and measurable way, and is commonly seen in Nevada. Weathering acts constantly on all surface material, slowly eroding it through chemical and physical processes caused by rain, wind, heating and cooling, frost, and other elements in the soil. When a stone tool is manufactured, its edges are sharp. Left on the surface for thousands of years, weathering erodes these sharp edges, making them progressively more rounded. The more rounded the edges, the longer the tool has been exposed to the elements. A digital program called the edge test was created, and a method of measuring the edges devised to provide a detailed quantitative analysis of relative age based on loss of sectional mass from artifact edges. The archaeologists were then able to pin these floating relative dates to absolute date ranges from the typology of the artifacts. For example, if they were testing a level wall core, they knew from excavated sites that this technology begins no earlier than 350,000 years ago, and runs in Namibia perhaps to 180,000 BP. Therefore, the floating date can be placed in an absolute time frame. Before 400,000 BP, the area had been inhabited. However, without stratigraphy or some alternative technique for dating the pebble tool finds, we cannot tell how early that would have been, except, of course, to note that Homo australopithecus had been all over South and East Africa by that time. Our next picture of settlement chronology is the Zebra River area, and that does not become clear till the lower Paleolithic makers of Acheulean hand axes can be distinguished by their technology. By 300,000 BP, Middle Stone Age peoples moved into the area. They had abandoned hand axes, preferring the prepared core technology of level wall tortoise cores, flakes, blades, and points, and after 200,000 BP, climatic change and the new drastic aridity forced Homo sapiens populations to migrate into areas that are more hospitable. Cooling conditions about 180,000 years ago, associated with the onset of marine isotope stage 6, made the region too arid to support human groups. Afterwards, there are no more stone tools until those of modern cave dwellers 5,000 years ago. Broad spectrum, wild resource, hunting and gathering, primitive communists. A research program started from the University of Cologne in 1978 with a phase of recording by the late Harold Pager that continued until 2006. In that year, with these recordings, supervised by Tilman Lesson Ertz, were published. A new, larger archaeological project is now currently underway. Daureb, or Brandenburg in its colonial name, is an isolated mountain formation 18 miles in diameter on the fringes of the Namibian desert. People had to have been attracted to the dramatically beautiful landscape ever since their arrival millions of years ago. Now, this landscape is now embellished with 1,000 rock art sites containing roughly 50,000 pictures. 80% of these have been published by Pager. The art was largely produced between 4,000 and 2,000 years ago by hunter-gatherers. Tilman Lesson Ertz had focused his efforts on the meaning of the pictures. He notes first that the ecological aspects expressed as metaphors in the rendering of animals, particularly of springbok gazelle, should be noted. Represented are harmonious social relations and harmony with nature, and are among the expressive repertoire of the springbok. In other words, exactly what we would expect among peoples of the animism, ideological stage in primitive communism. Their rock art was a medium confirming their beliefs in the face of such ever-present crises as drought, wildfires, and flash floods endangering their lives. A second meaning in the art concerns the role of women and men. The Daureb paintings portray a primitive communist view of gender roles in society. Women in prehistoric primitive communist times played a crucial role in ritual, and thus in the ideological world. Often men are depicted in daily physical experiences in the environmental world. However, this sexual dichotomy concerns only about 20% of the paintings. The vast majority are neither sexually marked, nor do they display behavior typical for one or the other sex. This fact throws new light on conventional perceptions of gender relations among prehistoric hunter-gatherers. It appears thus that the main concern of the painters of the Daureb was the promotion of a zero-marked human, that is, a person without any indications of sex, age, role, status, or rank. The third focus of research is on the rock art sites as one of the constituents of the meaning of art. Structural analysis of the sites suggests that use of the Daureb was not a matter of long-term planning, but of short-term crisis management, with a corresponding amount and type of ritual practice. By an analysis of several hundred sites, 7 types of sites were identified. From their quality and distribution, conclusions about the use of landscapes were drawn. And in generalizing terms, the essence of the meaning of the Daureb rock art can be summarized in 3 ideas: community, equality, and mobility. This maxim is what the painters most often expressed in their art. Accordingly, rock art was not only a means to maintain and pass on their encyclopedic knowledge, but also a tool of social management to keep up the ideological foundations of the hunter-gatherer society. Now we come to the Neolithic Revolution, the stage of tribal agriculture in Namibia, and specifically to Leopard Cave. By definition, the primitive communist epic ends with the stage of tribal agriculture. Included always are pastoral activities, as well as the strictly horticultural ones. In Namibia, researchers have found osteological evidence of the earliest known instances of domesticated sheep and goats in southern Africa, dated to the end of the first millennium BC. These researchers were led by David Plourdeau of the National Museum of Natural History in Paris and Eugene Marat of the National Museum of Namibia when they investigated remains from Leopard Cave in Namibia. The team was uncertain as to whether the bones are of sheep and goats, but there is no doubt that the teeth came from domesticated caprines. These remains have been found associated with hundreds of archaeological findings, including stone and bone tools, as well as beads and a few potsherds. They provide new data to the ongoing debate about the origins of domestication and herding practices in this region. The first appearance of domesticated caprines in the subcontinent was thought to be about 2000 BP, but recent genetic analysis supports the long-standing hypothesis of herder migration from the north. And this late Stone Age site of Leopard Cave at Erongo, Namibia, contains confirmed caprine remains from which we infer that domesticates were present in the southern African region and predate the first evidence of caprine domestication previously recorded for the subcontinent. This discovery sheds new light on the emergence of herding practices in southern Africa and also on the possible southward routes used by caprines along the western Atlantic coast. The Leopard Cave sheep remains are the oldest ones in the region, dating to 2270 BP, almost 200 years before the next oldest one, with a good date in Spolgrivier, western South Africa, dated at 2100 BP. However, we also have the uncertain, much older date on caprines at the Orowanjo site near the Angolan border. Caprines were the focus of the Perdue-Moreau research, but they are only two of the animals identified in Leopard Cave, with 16 bovines being the most important among domesticates, excluding ostriches known from eggshells. A few diverse rodents and birds prove broad-spectrum wild resource exploitation continued. Leopard Cave has stone artifacts and some pottery in association with floral and faunal remains. During the last 3 millennia, there were several migrations of tribal agriculturalists southwards into the subcontinent. Among these is the San, S-A-N, group of hunter-gatherer clans. The later migrations of the agro-pastoralist Bantu, B-A-N-T-U, occurred by AD 1500, and then the even more recent arrival of Europeans. However, the origins of the earliest herding practices are yet to be determined. Namibia experienced significant climate and environmental changes at this time, with a drying period succeeding a wetter period. The latter could have been conducive to the migration of animals through the presently very dry Kalahari area, and this area may have acted as a corridor of migration for both humans and animals from 2500 to 2000 BP. The main routes of southward migration were a central route through the Kalahari and Orange River, and a route that runs parallel to the western coast of Namibia. Namibia lies at the center of both routes, making it a potentially rich source of information about these migrations. Some Namibian sites such as Geldud, Mirabib, and Ruawanji 95-1 have yielded early remains of domesticated animals, bones in the form of caprine layers, but the sheep from Geldud and Mirabib and the goat from Ruawanji 95-1 lack direct dates. Although sheep or goats migrated to southern Africa around 2000 BP, this does not necessarily mean that they were accompanied by an influx of new human migrants. For over a century, linguists, anthropologists, and archaeologists have favored the autochthonous explanation for the first appearance of domesticates. Other scientists hypothesize the arrival of the Proto-Khoikhoi group as ancestral to the Hottentot pastoral populations. Hottentots are Khoi-speaking and were the first people encountered by the Europeans, who arrived on the southernmost coast of Africa at AD 1490, and then kept coming as a capitalist stage invasion. Recent genetic and linguistic studies support this hypothesis, although the place of origin of these early herders is unknown. A few isolated domesticate bones from hunter-gatherer contexts from around 2000 BP have been recovered, but no physical anthropological study allows for the arrival of a new population. Alternatively, cultural diffusion may have occurred, with animal domestication gradually into local hunter groups. So you can see there are a lot of basic questions still to be answered. But at any rate, Leopard Cave has human occupation levels from 3200 BP onwards, in the form of several hundred artifacts and fossil remains, including the directly dated Caprine remains. This is the earliest evidence of domesticates in southern Africa, and it adds to the debate regarding the possible timing and routes of domesticated animal migration toward the southernmost of Africa, approximately 2,500 to 2,000 years ago. The Khoisan non-sexual chromosomes is about the last thing I want to go into here. There is a new paper on southern African autosomal genetics with emphasis on pre-Bantu Aboriginal peoples previously known as Khoisan language people, authored by Joseph K. Pickerell et al., entitled The Genetic Prehistory of Southern Africa. The southern gatherer populations of southern and eastern Africa are considered essentially unaltered by historical contact. 22 populations with over 500,000 single nucleotide polymorphisms were analyzed, and the southern Africans herein called Khoisan fall into two groups loosely corresponding to the northwestern and southeastern Kalahari, which were separated within the last 30,000 years. All individuals derive at least a few percent of their genomes from admixture with the non-Khoisan populations that began 1,200 years ago. In addition, the Hadza, an East African hunter-gatherer population that speaks a language with click consonants, derived about a quarter of their ancestry from admixture with a population related to the Khoisan. This implies an ancient genetic link between the southern and eastern Africa. Unlike most other genetic studies, the southern African deities are not undersampled. Thus, a realistic genetic structure results. Khoisan peoples now occupy a distinct position in the overall human genome. Chiefdoms and kingdoms arose from the primitive communist stage of tribal agriculture, which we shall pursue in the next chapter and lecture. However, this autochthonous development was cut short by the arrival of armed European capitalist farmers. The best historical analogy is the arrival of European armed feudalists confronting the highest New World stage of slavery peoples in Mesoamerica and the Central Andes that we have discussed in volumes 1 and 2. And that concludes this particular lecture, and we will continue soon with much more.